You're listening to the Motley Biz. If it happens in the world, it gets discussed here. And now your host, Adrian Matthews.
And just like that, we've made it to the third episode of the Kronos Effect, and what a journey it has been. Now, I must warn you, if it's the first episode from the series that you intend to watch, I highly recommend that you watch the first two episodes, as I suspect you would probably be a little bit confused if you start watching now. So just go to my channel and either find the videos because there aren't too many, or click on the Kronos Effect playlist that I've put together for the sake of easiness. Now, in this third and final episode, Luca and I wrap up and try to give an answer to the big question. Are big tech companies and their domination of the market prohibiting, inhibiting, or stimulating innovation in the world, in the field of technology, of course? We're also looking into some further variables, how bad effects are mitigated currently, and how advantages are being stimulated by local authorities, private companies, and even by consumers. And finally, we're saying a bittersweet goodbye, hoping that at some point we will be able to come back with a new series. Without further ado, let's start the third and final episode of the Kronos Effect.
Right. Hello. Welcome back. Finally, episode 3 of the Kronos Effect. Hi, Luca. Welcome back.
Hello. How you doing?
Good. How's it going for you?
Great. Doing great.
So today we're wrapping up everything that we've talked about so far, and we're finally reaching a conclusion to our lovely, interesting topic, which actually caused some great stir on my LinkedIn and probably your LinkedIn pages as well. Before we go into the final words and before we kill Kronos, let's recap a little bit what's been happening and what have we talked about until now. And let's start with episode 1. What have we done?
Sure. Yeah. So episode 1, we defined the key concepts around innovation and around big tech platforms. So we took this Schumpeterian idea of innovation as the lifeblood of capitalism. We also tried debunking this myth around innovation itself, right? It's not a linear process that only occurs in the private sector, but it's one that results from a national innovation system, which includes universities, research institutes, companies, and the government. In the second episode, we zoomed in on big tech's place within this national innovation system, and we took one specific question under scope. Does big tech spur or stunt innovation? And we found that there's quite a complicated relationship there. So on the one hand, big tech companies have the capacity to disincentivize innovation in the market through what we called killer acquisitions and kill zones. But looking or moving beyond this market-centric approach, we find that big tech platforms are quite unique, not only in their size, but also in their positions in innovation ecosystems. So they are market creators. We talked about Amazon creating the smart home market last episode. And they're also technology diffusers. So Google's operating system diffusing all sorts of different technologies by app developers. Moreover, beyond their unique positions within innovation ecosystems, big tech platforms also finance a lot of R&D around AI and other enabling technologies with increases innovation. Looking at the other side, however, big tech financing usually comes around 10 to 15 years after the initial risky state-led basic research funding. And as a result of this, big tech focuses on sustaining innovations as opposed to disruptive innovations.
So what are we doing today? Where are we taking the conversation?
So today, we're going to return to a key question with which we began, namely around antitrust regulation. And the key question is, will antitrust regulation against big tech stifle innovation? And the way we kind of framed this question in the first episode was by looking at the geopolitical context, i.e. the rise of China. Because a really big argument that big tech likes to bring is that antitrust will deteriorate the competitiveness of US big tech companies against Chinese ones. So we're going to take a bit more of an in-depth look at that. In short, the answer is it will depend on whether we keep the current antitrust frameworks or whether we... Sorry?
Don't spoil it just yet.
Okay, I won't spoil it yet.
So let's start with what you said in the beginning, and let's look at antitrust. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what antitrust really is, what it was, and especially what it looks like in the current environment, which is completely dynamic and completely different from what it was 20 years ago. What does antitrust today?
Yeah, so antitrust today, it essentially aims to protect two types of actors, consumers and small competitors. Antitrust laws are regulations that encourage competition by limiting the market power of any particular firm. This is what people call monopoly power. So according to the prevailing neoclassical economic theory, monopolies are bad for consumers because they can set high prices, and they're bad for competitors because it's difficult for them to compete with a monopoly's economies of scale. So antitrust laws, for example, often ensure that mergers and acquisitions don't overly concentrate market power or form monopolies. And in the past, regulators have actually gone as far as breaking up firms that have become monopolies. The most famous example in the tech sector was AT&T in 1984. And the reason why all of this is really important today is because the big tech companies are in the crosshairs of antitrust regulators in the US, right? So Amazon and Apple for their dominance in online markets and digital infrastructure, Google for business practices related to its web and search service, and Facebook for a host of issues from enabling disinformation to election interference to manipulating user psychology. But here's the thing. I would argue that current antitrust frameworks are stuck in the past for two reasons. Firstly, they have a narrow focus on the size of the company, so big is bad. And secondly, they have a narrow focus on the effects on consumer welfare. So as if prices were the only indication of a healthy economic landscape for consumers. I can kind of take the listeners to both of these issues, right? First, the size and the scale, and then the focus on consumer welfare. When it comes to the size and scale of the company, the assumption in modern antitrust is that competition leads to innovation because of Schumpeter's idea of creative destruction. It's essentially the idea that new companies will disrupt the market by innovating and providing new value to customers, and thereby knocking the big incumbent companies off their perch. But that doesn't really hold up in the same way for today's big tech platforms because they're big, but they also provide value to customers due to their size. So as discussed in episode 1, big tech platforms benefit from network effects and winner-take-all dynamics. But the thing is, they can only take advantage of the benefits that data offers if they have a critical mass of users on both sides of the market. And we have to keep in mind that the unique capabilities that big tech has around data collection and use can be good for consumers, right? They offer low prices and lots of convenience, to name just two benefits. So if big tech companies are broken up, as suggested by modern antitrust, then they won't necessarily be able to deliver the same kind of value in terms of low prices and convenience to customers. The second critique is this focus on consumer welfare, specifically this focus on the prices paid for goods and services. This is too narrow, and it doesn't really tackle some of the deeper problems with big tech innovation. Given that tech companies often provide consumers with, or big tech companies provide consumers with, free or low price goods and services. So think about Google's search engine, Amazon's product delivery, and Facebook's social media platform. Because of that, the prevailing antitrust paradigm is kind of unable to rein in their power. Because let's face it, the currency for consumers is no longer measured in dollars, but in data. So this narrow focus on prices means that other harms that are being caused by big tech, including data privacy breaches, data collection, user psychology manipulation, misinformation, they can't be addressed by the antitrust. So it's not just...
Let's just repeat that one more time for the... I like that. That's really good. The new currency is no longer the dollar, but the data. And the data is the most valuable thing that a consumer has to give to a company, and the company can take data from the user as the most important thing. Continue, but I just really wanted to reinforce that, because that's really good and really applicable. So how does this apply in this context?
So in this context, the thing is, antitrust regulation is very much based on economic models from the 20th century. Data is very much it's very much part of this new business model that platforms have developed, right? Data is the currency that makes the platform tick. When it comes to Facebook's business model, it's about user retention. And how do you retain users? It's by essentially using their data in order to increase targeted advertising, which also increases the amount of advertisers that you have on one side of the market, and it means that users see content that they want to see. But it also has the more pernicious side of essentially, you are taking advantage of users' openness to just giving away their data without understanding the deeper implications of it.
Openness or willingness, or is it innocence?
I think it's a lack of understanding of what's being done and the wider implications of it.
So with these deficiencies, because obviously the system is deficient in the current circumstance, modern antitrust is probably a new concept that hasn't yet been elaborated. What should it look like given these circumstances? Should the current system be changed, or should it be scrapped completely and replaced by a new one?
So I guess, just building on the two critiques that we just talked about, I guess I can answer that question in two parts. The first is that we have to move beyond this focus on size and scale towards a focus on the unique capabilities of big tech platforms and how you can incentivize innovation using those capabilities. And secondly, we have to move beyond this focus on consumers and towards a focus on the needs and values of citizens. So let me begin with this first part, this need to move beyond size and scale towards a focus on the unique capabilities of big tech platforms and how we can take advantage of them in the service of innovation. Here, we're essentially talking about the dynamics that lead to innovation in an economy. So as we explored in episodes 1 and 2, innovation doesn't only happen in the private sector, and it's not only driven by competition between siloed companies. Innovation is a collaborative process driven by a multiplicity of actors that make up the national innovation system. That means that this question of antitrust is less about regulating big tech. It's more about governing big tech and governing its place within the national innovation system more generally. And that's why people have started replacing this notion of antitrust regulation with this notion of platform governance. And even though I'll be using these two terms interchangeably, I just want the listeners to know that there's a whole new agenda being developed around platform governance as a 21st century response to outdated and narrow antitrust regulation. But I guess, the next question leading on for that is, what are the key interventions that the state can deploy to take advantage of the capabilities of big tech platforms while spurring innovation? Well, there are two that I guess I can talk to you about. The first is public procurement. So procurement or public procurement essentially is acquiring or contracting goods, services, or tasks on behalf of a government or on behalf of a public agency. So in the 1960s, for example, when NASA set the Apollo mission to get an astronaut to the moon and bring them back to Earth safely again, they had to procure lots of different engineering parts and important activities from the private sector. The reason why it's important is because it strengthens linkages between public and private sector actors. In the case of big tech, public procurement takes advantage of private sector's impressive ability to solve problems using data and thereby direct innovation at a specific problem. So when we talk about public procurement, you're talking about driving and directing change within the digital economy. The second that I'd like to talk about is data sharing. And it can be understood as a lot of different things, but here I'm talking about creating the infrastructure that allows or enforces big tech players to share data with smaller competitors. the EU is kind of paving the way on this with its recently announced Data Governance Act. Data sharing, essentially, it tilts the playing field by sharing the thing that we were talking about before, the thing that makes big tech so powerful, data, to crowd in new players and support existing players to innovate. And this could also lead to more disruptive innovation as opposed to sustaining innovation, because smaller competitors are always looking for new ways of growing and displacing incumbents. So if they had the same access to data that big tech companies do, maybe that might change. And just to round off this point, I guess one of the best historical examples of proactive regulation or governance to spur innovation was the American National Innovation System in the 1950s and the 1960s. We briefly addressed this in episode 1, but in the post-war period, the United States developed a really effective national innovation system. And it did this through a set of policies including strong procurement and vast government investment in R&D. The interesting thing about this example is the parallels with today's threat of China argument, right? Because the US National Innovation System in the 1950s and 60s focused on maintaining a technological and military advantage over the Soviet Union, and they succeeded. In other words, it was because of government intervention and regulation over the National Innovation System that the US remained vastly more technologically advanced than the USSR. So today, rather than just talking about whether US big tech companies will remain competitive with Chinese tech companies despite regulation, maybe we should start talking about their competitiveness because of regulation.
Yeah, I was actually thinking when you were mentioning, the national innovation landscape and what particular governments or countries can do, something popped into my head, and I was thinking, I think one of the main catalysts for this whole Kronos effect is the international capacity of the internet. In other words, if one country or one country system decides to enforce very strict laws on an internet service provider or a provider of services on the internet like Google and Amazon and Facebook, there's nothing stopping them from moving to a completely different country. And we've actually seen a particular circumstance of this in Australia and in Europe. Instagram started restricting messaging capabilities for users in these countries because of GDPR laws and data protection laws, and these issues have been addressed. Now, do you think, with the risk of this episode taking double as much as any other episode, do you think there needs to be some global action taken rather than localized governments, and to accept this globalization, move beyond national competition and into a cooperation that will actually sustain and help every citizen of the world?
That's a really great question. You're kind of addressing one of the perennial problems of any sort of governance structure based on a nation state. I guess one thing I will say is that there have been examples of where effective regulation implemented on a national or on a regional scale has led to other countries adopting that same regulation. In other words, you can create a standard and others will follow suit. What I'm talking about is what you addressed as well, GDPR, right? It was developed in the EU by the European Commission. And because Europe is such a big body of consumers for big tech companies, a lot of other countries followed suit. And that means that, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, they had to adjust and create services in line with GDPR. The second thing I'll say is that maybe it is possible to create some sort of global approach to regulation. And the reason I'm saying that is because an idea that seems so foreign, i.e. a global corporate tax of, 20-25% that Janet Yellen and Biden are currently proposing, that's essentially a global policy. So in order for that to work, then you need the big players to be on board. You need the US, you need the EU, you need Russia, you need China. You need the people who actually have the weight to determine whether these companies can operate the way that they're currently operating.
Wouldn't it be amazing to have the actually bring the world together and help countries collaborate? Is that your topic or what? Now moving on to what you were saying, a change of focus from customers to consumers, and a focus on the needs of citizens. What type of needs are we talking about, and what, the big companies satisfying needs, it's the core of business, but at the same time the internet seems to be more entertaining than essential. So how do we satisfy these needs, and how do we move into it? What's the dynamics of that?
So here, we're really talking about value. Before I get to value, I want to take a step back and say, before when we were talking about moving beyond size and scale and moving towards capabilities of big tech companies, there we were talking about the dynamics of innovation. Here, when we're talking about a new need for a focus on the needs and values of citizens, we're talking about the type of innovation that we want. What kind of innovation do we actually want? If we agree with Schumpeter in arguing that innovation is the lifeblood, the essence of capitalism, then the way in which we shape innovation can shape the structure and direction of our economies. So if we only talk about more versus less innovation, then we're kind of missing the point, because the purpose of innovation ought to be in the service of society. In other words, it's not just about the rate of innovation, but also about the direction of innovation. And that's why we can't just talk about prices for big tech services. We have to talk about the values that citizens would like to see in the digital economy. And here I'm talking about values that go beyond prices and convenience. I'm talking about data privacy, data sovereignty and control. I'm talking about data protection and security, about non-discrimination and fairness. These values are crucial for shaping the kind of innovation that we want to see. And the obvious next question is, where do we start? So some early developments have been made by big tech actors themselves around ethical principles needed for new enabling technologies like AI, where we're going to be seeing a lot of new innovation over the next decade. So Microsoft, for example, has been the most vocal of the big tech companies around some of the biggest dangers that result from innovation. The company has called for 6 ethical principles for AI. So fairness, reliability and safety, privacy, inclusivity, transparency, and accountability. And this might be a good initiative, but this should really be coming from public ethics committees and oversight boards, not necessarily from the big tech companies themselves. So something else that we might consider is maybe the need for a set of digital rights for citizens. Because today digital rights are essentially still very much tied to human rights, and an explicit differentiation hasn't really yet occurred. So some human rights that relate to the online space include freedom of expression, privacy, freedom of association. But perhaps we need a new set of digital rights that are fit for the 21st century and fit for the rapid technological changes that we're witnessing, that could also be legally binding. So in summary, I guess, it's time to revisit and reconsider antitrust frameworks as they currently exist. It's not necessarily fit for the speed and the scope at which big tech companies are innovating and changing society, sometimes for the better, but mostly for the worse.
I was wondering, as you were talking about the digital rights for citizens and about a man's right to data protection, don't you think education should also play a great role in this? Because as you were talking to me about what a user would want and would expect from a digital service, I tended to disagree with you. I think they're looking for the main scope, and I think a very small proportion, albeit growing, because a lot of people are becoming digitally educated, and more people, but a very small proportion of users around the internet actually know what they consent to when they go on specific websites, actually know how to spot a shady website, with so many people falling for scams and phishing schemes. How do you think the states or the internet or the companies or anybody should educate users into what they should expect and how to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, I think it's a huge topic that a lot of people are talking about. Essentially, it's, how can you actually implement new digital elements of courses into the curricula around the country, around the world. Because what we're seeing right now, we might be seeing a generational shift, a shift from a generation that has nothing to do with the digital sphere, at least they didn't when they were younger, to a generation that are essentially digital natives. So this is already happening, but it's been happening more organically than necessarily proactively. Proactively, we could definitely do more in terms of regulating specific schools to have introductory coding courses, for example, or to have specific classes around the ethics of innovation or technology, right? These are definitely elements that we can implement. Or if we're talking about specific coding programs at university, I'm unaware of any big university that requires their students to take an ethics course related to those same courses. So maybe that's something that we can look into. Education is going to be crucial, especially when we're talking about the digital divides, when we're talking about huge segments of the population, huge segments of society who don't necessarily have those same access in terms of education and also infrastructure to digital technologies.
I was thinking, you know how in most countries, when you want to get a gun, you need to pass some tests and educate yourself a little bit. I was wondering whether something similar of a smaller scale, obviously, could eventually be implemented when people subscribe to an internet service provider, where they need to read something or they need to understand something or what they can happen to them on the internet. But anyways, I'm babbling. The point is, people will demand what they want, but they don't know that they want it yet. So I suppose it's essential for them to be told, you need to want your own privacy and you need to want innovation to happen, which I suppose will drive the market forward. So now, reaching a conclusion to the Kronos effect and bringing it back in, essentially, because we've kind of went off topic. What are we saying? What is the answer to our question? And how the hell do we kill Kronos?
Yeah, so I guess we'll take it back to the start, right? The Kronos effect. So as we began the series with, Tim Wu coined the term in his 2010 book, The Master Switch. And in the world of business, it's essentially come to refer to, as we discussed, the efforts undertaken by a dominant company to consume its potential successors in their infancy. These are essentially the killer acquisitions that we discussed in episode 2. But the reason we chose to title the series The Kronos Effect is because the term goes to the heart of innovation as a force in the economy and as a force in society. Innovation as a concept has more weight than people think when they throw it around, right? It doesn't just mean the new gadgets and services that big tech companies offer consumers at low or no prices. It doesn't just mean the activities that are funded by venture capitalists and angel investors in the market. And it doesn't just mean how much innovation we're getting and at which rate. Innovation refers to the phenomena that makes capitalism live and breathe. We're talking about business models, organizational processes, and yes, new wide-ranging enabling and general purpose technologies. We're talking about a national innovation system that is dependent on the financial certainty and crucial forethought of the state, and on the creativity of R&D institutes, basic research institutes, and private companies, including big tech. And we're talking about what kind of innovation we're getting, and what kind of value it will bring to citizens as well as consumers. So bringing it back to the question of antitrust, if big tech companies are serious in caring about American innovation and the country's competitiveness with China, then they have to accept that more governance by the state is going to be important. If the US government is serious about wanting to regulate big tech so that citizens are empowered while innovation is strengthened, then it needs a more comprehensive approach to antitrust. Most importantly, however, I think we all need to consider and discuss what values we'd like to see in the digital economy going forward. Will it really only be about price and convenience? Or should we think more critically about data, about privacy, and a host of other issues around innovation that are coming from big tech companies?
And that is a question to meditate on. And on that note, I think we all know the answer to the question, but we're not going to state it just yet, and we're going to leave a touch of rhetoricism just to make the podcast interesting. Now, before we wrap up, there are a couple of people that I'm sure you would like to mention as well as I would like to mention. First of all, Mariana Mazzucato, who is your tutor and mentor and inspired this this lovely podcast, and at the same time, Sruthi Thatchenkery, who is my tutor and mentor and who has inspired me to do this podcast and who also taught us both. We'd also like to thank Oscar, who got involved in the early podcast, and everybody who listened and posed questions. Any last words, Mr. Kuhn von Burgsdorff, before we wrap up?
I think those words spoke for themselves. But thank you to you, Adrian, for inviting me on the podcast. It's been a lovely experience.
And thank you to you for coming. Now, hopefully, we'll see each other again in some sort of episode that won't take a couple of months to produce. But if not, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I wish you the absolute best.
And with that said, we wrap up the Kronos Effect, and what a journey it has been. It did take a couple of months to produce this 3-episode series, so I would like to thank you very much from the bottom of mine and Luca's hearts for paying attention and for listening to the end. With that said, the Motley Biz does not end here along with the Kronos Effect, but we actually have a couple of exciting projects in store for you. Now, we're not going to be creating any official pages just yet because we don't have a frequency of posting yet. So if you want to stay tuned for updates, connect with me on LinkedIn, MateiAdrian, Adrian Matei, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. We promise we will not bug you with any weird notifications, and we barely upload them anyways. Now, I would like to thank you once again for listening, and I will see you on the next series on the Motley Biz. My name is Adrian Matthews, and it has been, like always, a pleasure.